In 1876, 268 U.S. 7th Cavalry troopers, led by George Armstrong Custer in his fringed buckskin coat, saber gleaming in his right hand, charged into Montana's Little Bighorn Valley. Facing them, 1,500 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, rallied by Sitting Bull, his feathered headdress swaying, a wooden staff gripped in his left hand as he rode a white pony. In just 90 minutes, all 268 soldiers lay dead, 56 mutilated beyond recognition, while over 50 native warriors perished defending their homeland. Historian Robert Utley records the Army's fatal miscalculation, estimating only 800 warriors. A myth of Custer's heroic last stand took root, yet native accounts, dismissed for a century, reveal a panicked rout. Honoring the Lakota and Cheyenne's valiant fight, we ask, how did 1,500 warriors obliterate a modern cavalry in under 2 hours? And what hidden truths unravel the legend? The Little Bighorn Valley in Montana, 1876, stretched along a winding river, its grassy hills and cottonwood groves deceptively tranquil. This landscape, home to vast herds of buffalo and roaming native tribes for centuries, stood on the brink of a brutal clash. On the 25th of June, over 1,500 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors gathered here, their teepees dotting the valley for nearly 3 miles. Historian D. Brown notes the valley's strategic depth, with ravines and ridges offering natural cover, ideal for defense. The U.S. Army, unaware of the camp's size, underestimated its strength, expecting fewer than 800 warriors. This serene setting, soon soaked in blood, became the stage for one of America's most shocking defeats, a tragedy rooted in ambition and miscalculation. The U.S. Army's campaign in 1876 aimed to crush the resistance of Northern Plains tribes and confine them to reservations. Over 2,000 troops, spread across 3 columns, marched into Montana to enforce this policy. The government sought to open the West for settlers, viewing the tribe's nomadic lifestyle as an obstacle. By spring, 7,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had left reservations, joining Sitting Bull's call to preserve their way of life. Historian Robert Utley estimates that 12,000 native people, including 4,000 non-combatants, camped along the Little Bighorn. This massive gathering, fueled by desperation, defied the Army's plans, setting the stage for a confrontation that would echo through history. Sitting Bull, a Hunkpapa Lakota chief, stood at the heart of this resistance, his presence commanding reverence. Clad in a beaded shirt, his feathered headdress swaying, he held a carved staff in his left hand, astride a painted pony. At 45 years old, he was no warrior in battle but a spiritual leader, uniting tribes through vision and resolve. He sent messengers to reservations, urging, "Come to my camp for the last big fight." Over 1,000 warriors answered, swelling his ranks to 1,500, a force unseen in Plains history. Historian Alvin Josephy praises Sitting Bull's diplomacy, noting his ability to forge a coalition of 10 tribes. His defiance, rooted in love for his people's freedom, turned the valley into a fortress. George Armstrong Custer, the 36-year-old commander of the 7th Cavalry, cut a striking figure in his fringed buckskin jacket, a wide-brimmed hat shading his sun-bleached hair. His saber hung at his side, and a pair of revolvers rested in holsters as he rode his chestnut horse, Vic. A Civil War hero at 23, Custer had earned fame for bold charges, with 11 horses shot from under him. By 1876, his 600-man regiment, including 50 Crow and Arikara scouts, was tasked with finding the native camp. Historian Evan Connell describes Custer's ambition, noting his dream of a presidential run fueled his recklessness. His confidence, bordering on arrogance, blinded him to the gathering storm. On the morning of the 25th of June, Custer's Crow scouts, perched on a high ridge, spotted the native village below, its teepees stretching 2 miles along the river. Smoke from cooking fires rose, and 10,000 ponies grazed the hills, signaling a camp of over 12,000 people. Scout Mitch Boyer, his long braids tucked under a felt hat, warned Custer of the camp's size, estimating 1,500 warriors. The Army's intelligence, based on outdated reports, predicted only 600-800 fighters. Historian James Donovan cites this error as critical, noting Custer dismissed Boyer's caution, believing his 600 men could overwhelm any native force. This misjudgment set a fatal course. Custer, undeterred, split his 600 men into 3 battalions to encircle the village. He sent Captain Frederick Benteen with 125 men to block escape routes to the south, ordering him to pitch into anything he found. Major Marcus Reno, in a blue kepi and holding a carbine, led 140 men to attack the village's southern end. Custer himself took 210 men north, planning to strike from the ridges. His force included 35 Crow and Arikara scouts, though only 6 stayed with him. Historian Gregory Mickno notes this division weakened the 7th Cavalry, leaving Custer's battalion isolated against a force 7 times its size. The decision, made in haste, sowed chaos. The myth of Custer's last stand took root soon after the battle, painting a heroic tableau of 268 soldiers fighting to their final breath. Books, paintings, and lectures depicted Custer, golden hair flowing, standing atop a hill, saber raised, as waves of warriors fell before him. By 1880, over 50 dime novels celebrated this image, selling 100,000 copies annually. Historian Brian Dippy calls it a national catharsis, easing the shame of defeat by glorifying sacrifice. The myth ignored native accounts, portraying the Lakota and Cheyenne as a faceless horde. This narrative, steeped in bias, erased the warriors' strategic triumph, cementing a lie that endured for a century. Custer's flamboyant persona fed this legend, his fame rivaling that of modern celebrities. At 36, he had written articles for newspapers, posed for photographs, and hosted dignitaries at his fort. His 1874 book, My Life on the Plains, sold 20,000 copies, boasting of his exploits. Clad in custom uniforms, he rode into battle as if on a stage, his ego noted by subordinates. Historian Paul Hutton argues Custer's need for glory drove his tactics, quoting a lieutenant who called him reckless to a fault. This larger-than-life image, while captivating, distorted the grim reality of his final hours, overshadowing the native victory. No survivors from Custer's 210-man battalion lived to tell their story, leaving a void filled by fiction. Of the 600 men in the 7th Cavalry, only Reno's and Benteen's units, totaling 350, survived, but they were miles away during Custer's fight. The absence of first-hand accounts allowed myths to flourish, with newspapers claiming Custer died sword in hand, surrounded by foes. Historian Nathaniel Philbrick notes that 268 bodies, many mutilated, were found by rescuers, yet none could speak. This silence, coupled with America's need for heroes, birthed a legend that buried the truth under layers of exaggeration. Popular culture cemented the myth, with over 200 books and 50 films by 1920 portraying the 7th Cavalry as valiant martyrs. The 1879 painting Custer's Last Fight, displayed in saloons nationwide, showed a defiant Custer amid a sea of arrows, selling 1 million lithographs. Hollywood's 1941 film They Died with Their Boots On drew 3 million viewers, ignoring native perspectives. Historian Richard Slotkin critiques this as cultural erasure, noting the Lakota and Cheyenne were reduced to stereotypes. The myth, while gripping, mocked the warriors' skill, dismissing their 1,500-man force as mere savages, a narrative science would later dismantle. A bitter irony cloaks the Battle of Little Bighorn, a crushing native victory, won by 1,500 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, was twisted into a tale glorifying the defeated. The myth of Custer's last stand, portraying 268 U.S. soldiers as heroic martyrs, dismissed the strategic brilliance of Sitting Bull's coalition. Historian D. Brown calls this distortion a deliberate whitewashing, noting that by 1900, over 300 books had ignored native accounts to exalt Custer. The 7th Cavalry, equipped with 600 Springfield carbines, was no match for the warriors' 800 firearms, yet the legend painted the natives as primitive. This erasure, rooted in cultural arrogance, silenced the truth of a battle where discipline crumbled under native prowess. Native oral traditions, passed down through generations, tell a starkly different story, one of chaos and cowardice among Custer's men. Lakota elder White Bull, who fought at 28, recounted soldiers shooting wildly in the air as panic overtook them. Cheyenne warrior Wooden Leg, age 19, described troopers fleeing like buffalo in a stampede. These accounts, recorded in over 50 interviews by 1930, were dismissed as unreliable by historians like Walter Camp, who favored Army reports. Yet, archaeologist Douglas Scott's 1980s excavations, yielding 5,000 artifacts, confirmed native narratives. Historian Robert Utley admits this oversight, stating, "We ignored the victors' voices for a century. The truth, long buried, began to surface through science." Archaeologists approached the Little Bighorn battlefield like a crime scene, unearthing evidence that shattered the heroic myth. From 1983 to 1985, teams led by Douglas Scott and Richard Fox recovered 5,237 artifacts across 1,200 acres. These included 1,800 cartridge cases, 1,200 bullets, and 300 personal items, each mapped with precision. Metal detectors, sweeping 10 miles of terrain, revealed the battle's brutal scope. Historian James Donovan notes that this forensic revolution transformed our understanding, proving the fight lasted just 90 minutes, not hours as myth suggested. The artifacts, silent witnesses to slaughter, exposed a frantic rout, not a gallant stand, restoring native accounts to their rightful place. Among the finds, a wedding ring, still encircling a soldier's finger bone, spoke of personal tragedy. Found near Calhoun Hill, the gold band, etched with faint initials, belonged to a trooper aged 20-25, likely an immigrant from Ireland or Germany, where 50% of the 7th Cavalry hailed. This relic, one of 12 personal items recovered, underscored the human cost. 268 families left grieving, unaware of their loved ones' fates for weeks. Historian Brian Dippy calls such finds heart-wrenching, noting they connect us to the forgotten men behind the myth. The ring, buried for 107 years, reminds us of the lives erased by a narrative that glorified defeat over truth. A single unfired .45 Springfield bullet, discovered near Last Stand Hill in 1984, tells a chilling tale of desperation. This 405-grain round, dropped by a trooper in his final moments, was one of 200 unfired bullets found, suggesting panic overtook training. The Springfield carbine, standard issue for the 7th 600 men, required 10 seconds to reload, a fatal flaw against rapid-fire native rifles. Historian Gregory Micknow estimates 30% of troopers fumbled their weapons under stress, a factor in their collapse. This bullet, gleaming after 108 years, stands as a mute witness to a young soldier, perhaps 22, frantically trying to load as 1,500 warriors closed in. Skeletal remains, unearthed from shallow graves, revealed the battle's savagery through forensic analysis. Of 44 trooper skeletons recovered, 80% bore multiple wounds, blunt trauma crushing skulls, axe cuts slicing femurs, and bullet holes piercing ribs. One soldier, aged 19, suffered 12 injuries, including a shattered jaw and a knife cut to the collarbone. Anthropologist P. Willie documented 3,000 wound marks across the remains, with 60% from close-range attacks. Historian Nathaniel Philbrick calls this evidence of overwhelming ferocity, proving native warriors, armed with 200 repeating rifles, dominated hand-to-hand combat. These bones, scarred by violence, debunked the myth of a disciplined defense. One set of remains, likely Vincent Charlie's, bore wounds that told a gruesome story. This Swiss immigrant, 5'10" and aged 25-30, was found with a .44 bullet in his hip, fragments embedded in the bone, and a stick jammed down his throat, a ritual act of desecration. Forensic analysis confirmed 5 wounds, 2 gunshot, 2 axe cuts, and a final head blow. Historian Evan Connell notes such mutilations, seen in 56 of 268 bodies, aim to impair soldiers' spirits in the afterlife. Charlie's skeleton, one of 7 identified, humanizes the 40% of foreign-born troopers, whose sacrifice was overshadowed by Custer's legend, yet their pain echoes through the ages. Forensic artist Betty Pat Gatliff, using Charlie's skull, reconstructed his face, restoring dignity to a forgotten soldier. Her work, completed in 1989, revealed a square-jawed man with deep-set eyes, likely a farmer before enlisting. Gatliff's technique, accurate in 90% of cases, used 25 measurements to sculpt facial features. The bust, displayed at the Battlefield Museum, drew 10,000 visitors by 1990. Historian Paul Hutton praises this as giving voice to the voiceless, noting Charlie's face challenges the myth's faceless heroes. This reconstruction, blending science and empathy, honors a man who died far from his Swiss homeland, caught in a war not his own. A skull fragment, possibly Mitch Boyer's, offered clues to another lost life, found near Deep Ravine. The bone, from a man aged 45, showed high cheekbones suggesting native ancestry and worn teeth from pipe smoking, indicating white heritage. A blunt blow crushed the left eye socket, one of 3 wounds. Boyer, a half Lakota scout, wore a felt hat and carried a carbine, loyal to Custer despite warnings. Historian James Welch estimates 20% of scouts were mixed race, bridging worlds yet dying in obscurity. This fragment, matched to Boyer's description, underscores the complex identities entangled in the battle's tragedy. The Little Bighorn battlefield, unique in its memorialization, is marked by 252 white marble stones, each pinpointing where a soldier fell. Erected in 1890, these markers, 12 inches tall, stretch from Last Stand Hill with 42 stones to Deep Ravine with 28. The South Skirmish Line, spanning 1 mile, holds 80 markers, showing a scattered retreat. Historian Richard Fox notes this layout, covering 5 square miles, is unmatched globally, preserving the battle's chaos. The stones, weathered by 135 Montana winters, stand as silent sentinels, mapping a defeat where 268 men perished, their final moments etched in stone and soil. From a high ridge overlooking the Little Bighorn Valley, George Armstrong Custer, in his fringed buckskin jacket and wide-brimmed hat, gazed upon a native village sprawling across 2 miles. On the 25th of June, 1876, over 12,000 Lakota and Cheyenne, including 1,500 warriors, filled the camp, their 10,000 ponies grazing the hills. Scout Mitch Boyer, his braids tucked under a felt hat, warned of the overwhelming force, estimating 1,500 fighters against Custer's 600 men. Historian James Donovan notes Custer's dismissal of this caution, citing his belief that no native force could resist his 7th Cavalry. Yet, with 210 men at his side, Custer resolved to attack, a decision historian Robert Utley calls a fatal overreach, sealing the fate of his command in a mere 90 minutes. Major Marcus Reno's battalion, 140 strong, charged the village's southern end, their blue kepis bobbing as they rode. Armed with .45 Springfield carbines, they aimed to scatter the camp but met fierce resistance from 500 warriors. Within 20 minutes, Reno's men, pinned down in a cottonwood grove, suffered 40 casualties, with 18 dead. Historian Gregory Mickno details the retreat, noting Reno lost 30% of his force before fleeing across the river. This failure left Custer's 210 men isolated, as 1,000 warriors, freed from Reno's threat, turned north. The collapse of Reno's attack, poorly planned and executed, exposed Custer's flank, a blunder that shifted the battle's momentum decisively. Custer, desperate to regain control, sent a scribbled note to Captain Frederick Benteen, whose 125 men patrolled the south. The message, penned by an aide on a torn page, read, "Come quick. Big village. Bring packs." Delivered by trumpeter John Martin, it reached Benteen 30 minutes later, but his battalion, slowed by rough terrain, was 5 miles away. Historian Nathaniel Philbrick argues this plea, sent at 3 p.m., came too late, as Benteen's 350 rounds per man could not reach Custer's 210 troops in time. The delay, compounded by Custer's earlier division of forces, left his men facing 1,500 warriors alone, their ammunition dwindling to 50 rounds per trooper. With the battle spiraling, Custer released his 35 Crow and Arikara scouts, sparing them the coming slaughter. Scout Curley, aged 22, recalled Custer's order, delivered through interpreter Mitch Boyer, "Boys, you're lucky. Get away as fast as you can." 6 scouts stayed, but 29 fled, surviving to tell their tale. Boyer, a half Lakota in a buckskin vest, chose loyalty, saying, "I signed up, I'm going to die with him." Historian James Welch estimates 20% of scouts face such dilemmas, torn between duty and survival. Boyer's decision, noble yet tragic, saw him ride into Medicine Tail Coulee, where 5,000 artifacts later marked the 7th Cavalry's doom. Custer's left wing, 80 men strong, moved down Medicine Tail Coulee, pursuing women and children fleeing north. Led by Custer on his chestnut horse Vic, they wore blue blouses and carried 600 Springfield carbines, each with 50 rounds. Their goal: capture non-combatants to force a native surrender. But 300 warriors, armed with 200 Henry rifles, blocked their path. Historian Richard Slotkin notes this tactic misfired, as 4,000 women and children escaped, rallying more fighters. The left wing's advance, halted 1 mile from the village, left Custer's 80 men exposed, with only 10 cartridge cases later found, signaling a brief, futile skirmish. The right wing, 120 men under Captain Miles Keogh, held Calhoun Hill, their gray horses tethered as they formed a skirmish line. Keogh, 36, in a black velvet jacket, clutched a .45 revolver, his 5'10 frame commanding 80 Irish and German troopers. Positioned 1 mile from Custer, they faced 500 warriors hiding in gullies. Archaeologist Douglas Scott found 200 cartridge cases here, spaced 5 yards apart, confirming a disciplined line. Historian Brian Dippy calls Keogh's stand the last gasp of order, as 42 marble markers later showed where his men fell. Yet, the line's static defense, designed for European wars, crumbled against the warriors' fluid tactics. At Calhoun Hill, Keogh's men fired 1,000 rounds, their Springfields effective at 600 yards but slow to reload. Facing them, 800 native firearms, including 200 repeating rifles, unleashed 3,000 rounds in 20 minutes. Lakota warrior runs the enemy, age 30, described bullets like rain from hidden ridges. Archaeologist Richard Fox mapped 300 native cartridge cases, proving warriors used terrain to outflank the troopers. Historian Evan Connell notes the 7th Thie's 25% reduction in firepower, as 30 horseholders idled, weakened Keogh's line. This mismatch, pitting 120 men against 500, turned Calhoun Hill into a slaughter, with 80 bodies later found. Warriors, wielding long-handled clubs and 47 types of guns, swarmed Calhoun Hill from 3 sides. Cheyenne warrior Wooden Leg, 19, recounted striking troopers' wrists, disabling their aim. Of 120 men, 100 died here, their 42 markers scattered across 500 yards. Archaeologist Douglas Scott found 50 native bullets embedded in trooper positions, evidence of close-range combat. Historian Paul Hutton calls this the battle's pivot, where native tactics overwhelmed army training. The warriors' 4-to-1 firepower advantage, honed by years of hunting, crushed Keogh's line, leaving 20 survivors to flee north. Their fate sealed. Panic gripped Calhoun Hill as troopers abandoned their skirmish line, clustering in tight groups. Archaeologist Richard Fox identified 3 clusters of 50 cartridge cases, each 10 yards wide, showing soldiers bunched under fire. Lakota warrior White Bull, 28, saw men huddled like scared rabbits. Of 120 troopers, 80% died within 15 minutes, their 1,000 rounds dwarfed by 3,000 native shots. Historian D. Brown notes this collapse as proof of native superiority, with 500 warriors exploiting panic. The 42 markers, later placed, trace a desperate stand, not a heroic one, as discipline dissolved into chaos. Lakota and Cheyenne accounts, vivid and unsparing, describe the unraveling of Custer's men. Hunkpapa warrior Ironhawk, age 24, recalled troopers running blindly, shooting at the sky. Over 50 native testimonies, collected by 1930, detail 268 soldiers falling in 90 minutes, with 56 mutilated. Cheyenne elder Two Moons, 29, noted, "No order, only fear," among the 7th. Historian Robert Utley validates these accounts, citing 5,000 artifacts that align with native descriptions. The warriors' voices, once ignored, reveal a rout where 1,500 fighters outmaneuvered 210 troopers, their 800 guns silencing the myth of a gallant last stand. The 7th Cavalry's 600 troopers relied on the .45 Springfield carbine, a single-shot weapon with a 600-yard range but a crippling flaw. Each round took 10 seconds to load. On the 25th of June, 1876, at Little Bighorn, this slow reload, 4 shots in 30 seconds, proved deadly against a swifter foe. Of the 600 carbines issued, 200 jammed under stress, leaving troopers vulnerable. Historian Evan Connell notes that 30% of the 7th E's 24,000 rounds were misfired or dropped, as evidenced by 200 unfired bullets found later. The Springfield's 405-grain slugs, designed for European wars, gave Custer's men, clad in blue blouses, a false sense of superiority, blinding them to the 500 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors closing in with deadlier arms. In stark contrast, the Native coalition wielded over 47 types of firearms, arming 800 of their 1,500 warriors. These ranged from 75 caliber flintlock pistols to 200 modern Henry repeating rifles, acquired through trade at posts like Fort Laramie. Over 300 muzzleloaders and 250 percussion rifles joined 200 Winchester repeaters, creating a versatile arsenal. Historian James Donovan estimates 60% of warriors carried guns, with 40% using bows or clubs for close combat. Archaeological finds of 1,800 cartridge cases show 47 distinct firing pin marks, proving the diversity of Native weapons. This firepower, amassed over a decade, turned the tide, exposing the Army's hubris in underestimating a savage foe. The Henry rifle, a Native favorite, fired 13 rounds in 30 seconds, its 16-shot magazine devastating at 200 yards. Of the 200 Henrys at Little Bighorn, 150 were used at Calhoun Hill, where 500 warriors overwhelmed 120 troopers. Each rifle weighing 9 pounds allowed warriors like Lakota Runs the Enemy, aged 30, to fire 1,000 rounds in 20 minutes. Historian Richard Slotkin calls the Henry a game changer, noting its rapid fire matched Native tactics of swift, close assaults. Compared to the Springfield's 1,000 rounds fired by 120 men, the Henry's 3,000 shots in the same time crushed Keogh's line, leaving 80 bodies across 500 yards. Firing pin impressions on 1,800 cartridge cases revealed a chilling truth. Native warriors captured and used Springfield carbines against Custer's men. Archaeologist Douglas Scott matched 50 cases from Calhoun Hill to Last Stand Hill, 1 mile apart, showing 20 rifles taken from 80 fallen troopers. Lakota warrior White Bull, 28, described seizing a carbine and firing 10 rounds at fleeing soldiers. Historian Nathaniel Philbrick estimates 100 captured weapons, boosting Native firepower by 12%. This adaptability, honed by years of hunting, turned the 7th's own guns against them, a grim irony that 42 marble markers at Calhoun Hill silently attest. Native warriors acquired their 800 firearms through legitimate trade, not theft, debunking myths of ill-gotten arms. By 1876, 50 trading posts across the plains sold 10,000 guns annually, with 2,000 reaching Lakota and Cheyenne hands. Rifles like the .44 Henry, costing 20 buffalo hides, were bought for hunting, yet 300 were repurposed for war. Historian D. Brown notes that 70% of Native guns were traded at Fort Benton, where 500 Henrys changed hands from 1870-75. This commerce, legal and routine, armed Sitting Bull's 1,500 warriors, whose 47 gun types outmatched the 7th E's 600 Springfields, proving preparation, not savagery, won the day. The 7th Cavalry's tactics, rooted in an 1874 manual, were woefully outdated against Native warfare. Designed for Prussian-style battles, the skirmish line spaced 600 troopers 5 yards apart, firing 24,000 rounds in volleys. At Little Bighorn, 210 men under Custer followed this rigid plan, dismounting to shoot while 50 horse holders idled, slashing firepower by 25%. Historian Paul Hutton calls this a fatal mismatch, as 1,500 warriors, unbound by formations, used 200 gullies for cover. The Army's 1,800 cartridge cases, spread over 5 miles, show static positions, while 3,000 native cases trace fluid attacks, exposing a doctrine blind to the plains' realities. Dismounted, the 7th Thie's 210 troopers lost mobility, their 600 horses tethered 100 yards back. Each man carried 50 rounds, but reloading under fire left 30% of 24,000 rounds unused, with 200 bullets dropped. Cheyenne warrior 2 Moons 29 noted troopers stuck like rocks as 500 warriors circled. Historian Gregory Mickno estimates 40% of the 7th Thie's 600 men were pinned by 800 native guns unable to maneuver. The 1874 tactic, effective at 600 yards, failed at 50 yards, where 200 Henry rifles fired 3,000 rounds in 15 minutes. This immobility, etched in 252 marble markers, doomed Custer's command to a swift rout. Native warriors fought with precision, their long-handled clubs and axes striking like lightning. Lakota Iron Hawk, 24, describes smashing a trooper's wrist, then backhanding his temple, felling him in seconds. Of 1,500 warriors, 500 used such weapons, with 44% of 268 trooper skeletons showing axe or club wounds. Anthropologist P. Willie found 3,000 cut marks, 60% from close combat, on 44 remains. Historian Brian Dippy notes this personal warfare suited the plains, where 300 warriors trained as hunters struck 80 troopers at Calhoun Hill. Their 800 guns, paired with melee, left 42 markers scattered, a testament to relentless skill. Over 200 native repeating rifles, firing 3,000 rounds in 20 minutes, tipped the battle's balance. At Calhoun Hill, 150 Henrys and 50 Winchesters overwhelmed 120 troopers, whose 1,000 Springfield shots paled in comparison. Archaeologist Richard Fox found 300 native cartridge cases, 70% from repeaters, across 500 yards. Historian James Welch estimates a 4-to-1 firepower edge, with 800 armed warriors facing 210 soldiers. Lakota runs the enemy, firing 20 rounds from a Henry, recalled no pause in the assault. This barrage, unmatched by the 7th Thie's 600 carbines, shattered their lines, leaving 80 dead in 15 minutes, a slaughter the myth could not conceal. Archaeological evidence, with 5,237 artifacts, obliterates the myth of native warriors armed only with bows and arrows. Of 1,800 cartridge cases, 1,200 came from 47 gun types, including 200 Henrys and 250 percussion rifles. Only 300 warriors used bows, firing 1,000 arrows, while 800 wielded firearms, 60% modern. Historian Robert Utley calls this a revelation, noting 3,000 native rounds dwarfed the 7th Thie's 1,800. At Last Stand Hill, 50 native bullets pierced 42 trooper positions, while 10 Army cases showed feeble resistance. The 1,500 warriors, with 800 guns, proved their mastery, rewriting a narrative that belittled their victory for a century. The 7th Cavalry's 600 troopers, averaging 22 years old, stood 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed 150 pounds. Their blue uniforms faded from weeks in the Montana sun. On the 25th of June, 1876, at Little Bighorn, 50% of these men, 300 in total, were immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and England, drawn to the Army by poverty. Of the 268 who died with Custer, 120 were foreign-born, their names etched on enlistment rolls but lost to history's myth. Historian Evan Connell notes that 80% of these men, earning $13 a month, joined for survival, not glory. Their youth and inexperience, facing 1,500 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, left them ill-prepared for the carnage that unfolded in 90 minutes, a grim testament to a flawed campaign. Among the 600 troopers, 30 recruits, some as young as 16, enlisted illegally, desperate for a wage. Army regulations required men to be 21, yet 5% of the 7th Cavalry, or 30 soldiers, were underage, their youth confirmed by skeletal remains showing unfused bones. Historian Nathaniel Philbrick cites enlistment records, noting 15 boys aged 16-17 died with Custer, their 5.6 frames buried near Calhoun Hill. These teenagers, promised adventure, faced 800 native firearms, including 200 Henry rifles firing 3,000 rounds in 20 minutes. Their inexperience, reflected in 200 dropped bullets, contributed to the rout, a tragic cost of the Army's lax recruitment in 1876. Forensic analysis of 44 trooper skeletons revealed lives of hardship, their bones scarred by toil. Of these, 80% showed tobacco-stained teeth, with 30 skulls bearing black tar from pipe smoking. Poor diets left 60% with decayed teeth, and 20% had arthritis at 22, their vertebrae pitted from riding 1,000 miles. Anthropologist P. Willie documented 3,000 bone lesions, with 15 skeletons showing spinal damage from weeks in the saddle. Historian Paul Hutton calls them broken men, noting 70% of the 7th 600 men suffered malnutrition. These ailments, ignored by commanders like Custer, weakened the 268 who faced 1,500 warriors, their bodies failing before the battle began. The 7th Cavalry's grueling march left them exhausted by the 25th of June, their 600 men riding 80 miles in 3 days without rest. Each trooper, carrying 50 rounds and a 9-pound Springfield carbine, endured 12-hour night marches, their 600 horses faltering. Of the 268 dead, 90% showed signs of fatigue, with 44 skeletons bearing stress fractures. Historian James Donovan estimates 40% of the 7th's 24,000 rounds were ineffective due to exhaustion, as 200 unfired bullets littered the field. Lakota warrior White Bull, 28, noted troopers, swaying like drunks. This depletion, ignored by Custer, left 210 men unfit to face 800 native guns, sealing their doom. Calhoun Hill marked the battle's turning point, where Captain Miles Keogh's 120 men fell in a 15-minute slaughter. Of these, 100 died, their 42 marble markers scattered across 500 yards, tracing a panicked retreat. Archaeologist Richard Fox found 200 Springfield cartridge cases, but 300 native bullets, 70% from Henry rifles, overwhelmed them. Lakota runs the enemy, 30, described men falling like grasshoppers as 500 warriors swarmed. Historian D. Brown calls this the collapse of discipline, with 80% of Keogh's men killed by 3,000 native rounds. The 20 survivors, fleeing north, carried only 50 rounds each, their 600-yard Springfields useless against 200-yard repeaters. Only 20 of Keogh's 120 men reached Custer's 105-man left wing on Last Stand Hill, halving the battalion to 125. These survivors, mostly Irish and German, wore tattered blue coats, their 50 rounds nearly spent. Archaeologist Douglas Scott found 10 Springfield cases on the hill, against 300 native bullets, showing a one-sided fight. Historian Brian Dippy notes that 42 markers on the hill, covering 200 yards, mark where Custer's men huddled. Cheyenne Two Moons, 29, recalled no fight left, as 1,000 warriors encircled them. The reunion, meant to bolster defense, crumbled under 800 native guns, leaving 125 men to face their end. On Last Stand Hill, desperate trumpet calls pierced the air as Custer, in his buckskin jacket, barked orders to 125 men. At 3:30 p.m., 40 dismounted troopers, clutching 9-pound Springfields, fled toward the river, joined by 9 riders on gray horses. Archaeologist Richard Fox found 5 cartridge cases, showing no return fire. Lakota Ironhawk, 24, saw them run like scared dogs. Historian Robert Utley estimates 90% died within 5 minutes, with 42 markers tracing their flight. The 800 native rifles, firing 3,000 rounds, overwhelmed the 125 troopers, whose 24,000 rounds were useless at 50 yards, ending hopes of a heroic stand. Deep Ravine, not Last Stand Hill, was the final battleground, where 28 troopers sought refuge in a 100-yard gully. Hunk Papa Tall Bull, 27, heard a war whoop as 300 warriors fired from above, their 200 Henry rifles unleashing 1,000 rounds, Archaeologist Douglas Scott found 50 native cartridge cases along the ravine's rim, but only 3 Army bullets, signaling surrender. Historian Gregory Mickno notes 28 bodies, unmarked by stones, lie buried here. Cheyenne Big Beaver, 20, recalled, "No fight, only death." The 90-minute battle ended here, with 1,500 warriors crushing 268 soldiers, debunking the myth of a gallant last stand. Native accounts, vivid and unsparing, paint a scene of terror among the 7,000 210 men. Hunkpapa Iron Hawk, 24, saw troopers shooting at the sky, running blindly. Over 50 testimonies collected by 1930 describe 268 soldiers falling, 56 mutilated with axes and knives. Cheyenne Wooden Leg, 19, likened the rout to chasing buffalo. Historian Robert Utley validates these with 5,237 artifacts, including 1,800 cartridge cases, aligning with native stories. The 1,500 warriors, led by Sitting Bull's vision, used 800 guns to outmaneuver Custer's 600 carbines, their victory a testament to skill, not savagery, long ignored by history. The rout at Deep Ravine, where 28 troopers died, closed the 90-minute battle, leaving 268 U.S. bodies across 5 miles. Of these, 56 were mutilated, with 44 skeletons showing 3,000 cut marks from axes and knives, a Lakota ritual to impair spirits. Historian Evan Connell notes 80% of the 7th 600 men died without firing, their 24,000 rounds dwarfed by 3,000 native shots. Cheyenne Two Moons, 29, described soldiers falling like leaves. The 1,500 warriors, with 800 firearms, dominated, their 47 gun types shattering the 7th 210-man stand. This final act, buried under myth, honors the Lakota and Cheyenne's fierce defense of their homeland. In the blood-soaked dust of Deep Ravine, the Battle of Little Bighorn ended in a mere 90 minutes, leaving 268 U.S. soldiers and over 50 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors dead. The 7th Cavalry's 600 men, outmatched by 1,500 native fighters wielding 800 firearms, fell in a frantic rout, their 24,000 rounds no match for 3,000 native bullets. The 44 skeletons, bearing 3,000 wounds and 5,237 artifacts, tell a story of chaos, not heroism, aligning with Hunkpapa Ironhawk's words, "They ran like scared dogs." The Lakota and Cheyenne, under Sitting Bull's vision, fought to protect their way of life, their 47 gun types and 200 Henry rifles crushing a modern army. Yet, their victory, costing 56 mutilated U.S. bodies and 28 unmarked graves in Deep Ravine, was fleeting. By 1877, 7,000 native people were forced onto reservations, their freedom lost. Historian Robert Utley calls this a triumph turned tragedy, as the Plains tribe's nomadic life ended within a decade. With deep respect for the Lakota and Cheyenne's courage, we honor their 1,500 warriors who defied 600 soldiers to defend their homeland. Their voices, preserved in 50 testimonies and validated by 1,800 cartridge cases, rewrite a century-old myth. As we reflect on their resilience, a question remains: how can we, with